Mumra Mekaya home.
Recording is on.
And it said, and they are Quadilla Numre, the Simon Quan of Science from New and Yansis from Coson.
Recording is on.
I don't miss Bibi and Bear, the Pabe, I don't bench, Raben Coswa. They say a Tonya, a Titafua, and Ato. And Timon Geneti, a Chitinapa. They saw her Hamukra Mumanaska, Mumaywa Bediasa. They say young people surround Mansaka, and Timon Pian and Cosra Sanka Bibi, I don't bench, Raben Coswa, Ben Kunimji, and Yamaya and Abibifonina. After they said they are Tumana, they are Tumana Nacosonotum, who plays a go, Yonko Swan, and go so, and Dinipa Boniphobia, a canon corner before Jadia, or Bonibra May, or Janshenas Fuinas and Kabako, or me tutu, ile tutu, or the tutu, or not tutu, tutu laroye, Iba Lord de Mare, the Kaye, Iba by Rumale of Ducotson, Iba by Rumale of Ducosi, Iba Rumila, Barakwetu, Iba Fa, a Kerefino Shaban, Iba Koda, Iba Sheda, Iba Balotufe. Iba Shango, Iba Ibeji, Iba Yemoda, Iba Oshun, Iba Ogun, Iba Oya, Iba Olokun, Iba Obatala, Iba Ishu, Iba Eyan Iwaju, Awaleroe, bí Èkó ló bá júbà, ilẹ̀ alanu, ọmọ tí kì í júbà, Iba pa, ewúrẹ́ tí kò bá júbà, ó dára àmúso, kí n kò má ṣe mí, kí n kò má ṣe bí mi, kí n kò má ṣe ìyàwó mi, kí n kò má ṣe wọn. Àmọ́ mi kí n kàn máa ṣe àwọn èèyàn dúdú tí wọ́n wá sí Abibitumi láti fẹ́ títí nǹkan tí a máa sọ lónìí. Ìbà fún àwọn èèyàn dúdú tí wọ́n jà láti gbára wà lọ́dọ̀ wọn táwọn òyìnbó. Ká ní ìlọsíwájú àti ìtẹ̀síwájú, ká kọ́ gbọ́ngbọ́n, ká kọ́ lọ́mọ́lá, ká lọ́wọ́ lọ́wọ́, ká lọ́wọ́ láyé. Àṣẹ, àṣẹ, àṣẹ ooo. Ìbà fún àṣẹ.
Àṣẹ. Àṣẹ.
Àṣẹ.
Àṣẹ. All right, so Black Slowly, we are ready to go ahead and get started. I'm sure people will be filing in. We have 75 RSVPs. We got 17 in the room so far. I know people are going to be coming in all the way up to 6:30 Ghana time, but to respect the time of those of you who are already here, we do want to go ahead and get started. And as always, we always want to call the spirits of our ancestors, the Abosom and Oludumare. So with that, you know, we do our libation. When we talk about African, it's not just one single ethnic group. So we do our libation in Chi and then also in Yoruba, because we are all committed to you. We're all Black people at the end of the day. So Chief Foday, Blacktastic to see you online.
Yes, sir. Thank you very much for the invitation, man. I'm so honored to be here.
Absolutely. Now, what we had in mind for this was actually the brainchild of Ina Ajua, aka Mama Zena. And what she said is that the way she envisioned this was a semi-formal, more so informal discussion between two brothers who are doing the work on the ground here in Ghana. So as we're discussing repatriation, the idea is that it's going to be an open dialogue in the sense that, you know, people are not only listening, but then any questions from those who are actually doing it. Like every day I see people who are coming up with new YouTube channels about how to repatriate, and they have never repatriated, or they got channels on how to repatriate and they've been here 1 month. So, you know, for those who have been here, I know you've been on the ground for 8 years, in my case, 13 years. So, you know, what do you have for us? Maybe just some opening thoughts, any ideas to kind of set the tone for the discussion, and then we'll just take it from there.
Yeah, well, I think I would just piggyback off of where you started at, you know, in terms of this new trend of people jumping on YouTube. And in our previous discussion, we talked about building up the enemy's institutions in the first place.
Right.
And at the same time, neglecting independent institutions like these. And, you know, just the whole frenzy of it, I'm very surprised to see it, because it seems not to be any checks or balances in place. And not enough people know about the clean glass of water alternative. But, you know, what I can say is that I came here in 2013. I live in Freetown, Sierra Leone. I came here as a Pan-Africanist. I came here looking to get involved with the struggle, basically to expand the organization that I was a part of, that is still a part of, the lead. And just to come home, man, you know, just to be here. I understood from struggling in the United States against that system there that the final solution will will be in Africa. It won't be there. You know, fighting behind enemy lines can only make us stronger, but it can't get us free. And at some point, we have to export ourselves, you know, exodus ourselves from the land of our exile. And the transition hasn't been smooth. I don't think it's smooth for any honest repatriate. You know, the Western world has really twisted our minds, and our African sensitivities are off, and we don't know it until we get here. And a visit, a tour won't give you that experience. A visit is designed to give you nothing but a good experience. Whereas living here, you get to understand the good, the bad, and the ugly, and to really assess the contradictions. You get to examine the mentality of our people here. You get to understand how the economics go here. You get to see the contradictions of the politics. Even if you never say anything, you get to analyze it. You get to really evaluate neo-colonialism up close and personal at the source. And that is, for me, has been very transformative. And what we do here a lot is engage communities in projects that they own, that they control, and we train them through those projects. And we try to focus more on human development, you know, just encouraging the people and supporting them in sustainable farming, providing youth with more activities to do. We have a cultural drama group here, and just creating development institutions based on what we know the people need, and empowering the people in the process. Very, very powerful exchange happens when you're actually here, living here. I was involved in Pan-African organizing for years before I came here. And for 6 years, I was already providing support and being a real solidarity force to several Pan-African organizations here in Sierra Leone and other parts of Africa. And I chose Sierra Leone primarily because of the work that I was doing with the brothers and sisters here on the ground from afar. And when I got here, nothing that I ever experienced in the United States of America would have prepared me for the reality of Africa and the adjustment that it would take. And so I'm a bit taken back by people who have never repatriated, who haven't spent a month, you know, a year, 2 years, 3 years, you know, who haven't really experienced the transition, to be able to be the authorities on the matter, so to speak. So that's where I'm at with it. So I think it's a good area to start at, basically the commercialization of repatriation, whereas we were taken into exile by force, but now we have the power and the ability to exodus ourselves voluntarily in a whole new age and a whole new era with new conditions in the world and great challenges ahead. So that's what I would say. I think that we really have to come up with a solution to that, because our people are looking for the answers. Or even those who are bankrolling off of YouTube, they wouldn't be doing it if our people weren't actually looking for the answers. So that's what I would say. Yeah, brother, you there?
You hear me? I go. Okay, all right, good. All right, yeah, so I was saying that it reminds me of not too long ago, we sent out a newsletter about learning an African language. And the person there was like, you know, why should I, you know, go to Africa? You know, I need to be here and build. And he's talking about in the United States, right? He's like, yeah, I want to be here and build. So what I did is I just, you know, replied back to him by saying Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, 1985, Roseville, Florida, 1923, Tulsa, Oklahoma, 1921, right. Oakland, Florida, 1920, Elaine, Arkansas, 1919, Atlanta, Georgia, 1906. So he has to even know what I'm talking about, right? Wilmington, North Carolina, 1898, Thibodaux, Louisiana, 1887, Coushatta, Louisiana, 1874, Eufaula, Alabama, 1874, Colfax, Louisiana, 1873, Opelousas, Louisiana, 1868, Henning, Tennessee, 1864, Saltville, Virginia, 1864. And I just told him good luck with that. Stockholm Syndrome is real.
Oh, yeah.
But one thing that I realized is that Stockholm Syndrome is easier to diagnose than it is to cure. So it's one thing to tell somebody you're suffering from Stockholm Syndrome. It's an entirely different thing to say, and here's the cure for it, right? Because people are literally in love with financing our enemies. And I think part of it is the delusion that people tell themselves that they're fighting our enemies. So it's like, yo, I did a protest march, so I'm fighting my enemy. But it's like, hold on, are you fighting your enemy or are you financing your enemy? Because at that protest march, everybody had on new sneakers. I saw y'all. And I know where y'all got those sneakers from, right? I know Foot Locker. I ain't somebody from, backwoods of Russia. I know where you got them sneakers from when I see you on the video, right? Everybody got a camera for a selfie. I know y'all was standing in line around the block for the new iPhone so you could take a selfie and talk about how you're fighting. So, like, if we actually just look at all the components that go into the people who said they're fighting, and then they're just going to do hashtags on the Cracker platform, so forth and so on, you know very well that these are people who are financing their enemies at a very high level. Whereas when you're repatriating, what you're doing is you're actually divesting from your enemy at a very high level and then investing. So when we talk about investing, I think this is a good direction to take the conversation. Most people think about investing in Africa. So the discussion is repatriating and investing in Africa. Most people think about investing in Africa in the sense of dollars, right? In the sense of pounds or, whatever type of currency they have. Yeah, I'm going to invest and I'm going to go get a profit. I'm going to, run a profit on this and that and the third. But one thing that my father, Baba Kamal, always talks about is terms. And that's time, energy / emotions, resources, money / material, and then spirit / space. That's terms. So when we think about investing, we can think in terms of our terms. What type of time are you investing? Now, when we are in Crackerville, all of us know good and well that the large lion's share majority of our time is spent building the Cracker Nation, working 9 to 5 for some type of cracker, right? And even if you are working for somebody black, you know that black person is paying the same taxes that are building the prisons. You know that everybody's paying the same taxes that buy the bullets that shoot us down the streets. So that's the time. So usually all we'll have time for is on the weekend, I'll go attend a lecture and I'll think good thoughts about black people and then I'm doing my part. But then the majority of my time is invested in building Crackerville into what it is and aiding and abetting a criminal organization so that it can now take my time, energy, resources, so forth and so on, in order to bomb the continent, in order to steal the land, in order to rape the resources and so forth and so on. So I think that that's maybe something that, maybe if you could speak on that as well, and I may also come back, on it, but just to introduce this concept of terms when we're thinking about investment and not just strictly, the pictures of dead presidents, dead crackers, and slavers. What are we talking about in terms of investment on the ground in terms of your terms?
Absolutely. Well, let me just say that when I think of repatriation, I think of it as a mass movement, something that is well organized and something that has a definite destination, a set of objectives and goals, and not just individuals with their individual money choosing to go to one place and setting up shop for themselves. I don't view repatriation may be that, but Exodus itself is something that is a mass movement. And let me give you some historic examples because I like the way that you responded to the individual by giving them the dates and quoting the history.
Right.
To put repatriation into perspective historically, the first group of Africans from the diaspora to repatriate, it happened in 1787, and they came here to Freetown, Sierra Leone. The second group actually was the founding group of Freetown, Sierra Leone that birthed the Creole community, language, and culture here in not only Sierra Leone, but spread throughout West Africa. these were formerly enslaved Africans, largely from the same counties and states and cities that many African Americans today are born in, since that's what they want to be called. So we're talking about over 200 and nearly 30 years of exodus, and these were groups. The only thing was that these groups were being exiled, they were being expelled, but they were told, they were given promises, they were told lies. And they thought in their minds that they were returning for freedom and land. That's what they fought in the American Revolution for. That was the promise. For about 5 years, those who came from Nova Scotia were in Canada. And when it was in Canada, of course, the conditions just wasn't right. They ain't dig it. It was too cold. And, you know, the cracker was just nasty. So they chose to go to Britain and appeal to the so-called anti-slavery abolitionist white folk to help them out, get them back to Africa. So one, this is the first example of Africans voluntarily choosing, okay, you gave us freedom in Canada, but we don't want this. Let's send a protest movement to the cracker house. And since these crackers talking about anti-slavery, and they already sent some of our brothers and sisters from Britain down to Freetown in a failed settlement, why don't we go to them and tell them, man, get us up out of here? And 1/3 of the Africans who were, you know, taken to Canada after the American Revolution by the British, they repatriated. And that was the first exodus back from the diaspora. You also have other groups that made the same exodus, like the Jamaica Maroons. They made the exodus in the year 1800. And it's crazy because when we understand how they did that, we'll understand that even in this repatriation movement, we have antagonisms that need to be addressed at all times. Everyone is not coming back with the same intentions or loyalties. That's just the reality of it. Telling you this history allows me to explain that history does repeat itself, and even those today who are repatriating and organizing these exodus movements at this time are still confronted with this. The individualistic repatriate and the collectivist exoder. The person who understands that we're all coming as a collective to serve our role in Africa. Now, of course, the diaspora is our place of forced exile. That can never be our home. But at the same time, understand that in the future, you also had 1822, Liberia Exodus. Both of these exodus are controlled by our enemies, mind you. They're the ones would come back on their ships. You know, we're coming back from the diaspora, and our ways have been corrupted and corroded. Our views, even of ourselves, of our color, of our race, of our people back in Africa, has been forcefully transformed. We're Africans, but we're strangers. We don't understand the ground. We come back. And at the end of the day, in the future, you had other people come too. Now, after the Civil War, there was another exodus that most people don't know much about. It was called the Liberian Exodus. In 1865, well, let me say 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation time, on up to 1887 in our story. And during that era was the first time that African people, formerly enslaved African people, and those who thought they was quote unquote free, but were segregated within the North and within the cities, we finally had an opportunity to act as a political being, to form a political reality. And of course, it took shape around our spiritual institutions and our beliefs. This is why you're seeing a great emergence of independent African churches emerging, because the church wasn't just about praising white Jesus. It also was the foundation of our community, the first place where we could organize and strategize politically, organize and strategize socially, culturally, you know? And so we utilized the institution at that time to empower ourselves. And following that, you know, these crackers ain't shit, man. Excuse my language. On one hand, they claim to have given us emancipation, but we fought for it. And the emancipation wasn't a liberation, and it wasn't a citizenship either. It was another form of subjugation. And it led to a new economy that reconciled with the interests of white workers and their demand to have African people not contest for their jobs, not contest for their position. These are the poor whites now. This is why when you see historically during the lynching times where they were lynching our ancestors, it wasn't necessarily the poor African brother or sister. It typically was that prosperous farmer, that prominent preacher, you know? And so they had targets. They knew they had a profile that they lynched. And so we have to understand that as well. People who pose a threat, that they felt as though posed a threat. Now, in 1876, 1877, the federal government of the United States, the company, actually formed an agreement with the former Confederate states through the Tilden-Hayes Agreement, and the federal protection or the federal army was removed from the southern states and power was turned back over to the Confederates. In a response to that, there was a movement that was sparked out of Charleston, South Carolina, that led to several hundred Africans returning back from the United States, from South Carolina, some from Virginia, returning back, and ultimately you have people like Tubman, President Tubman from Liberia, who descends from that particular exodus. And so we have this international connection that's been going on for hundreds of years. And so when people think that it's something brand new to say, hey, let's repatriate, we have to give them the facts. And all of what I'm telling you is long before Marcus Garvey. Marcus Garvey said Africa for Africans, those at home and those abroad. But let's talk about Martin Delany. Let's talk about Martin Delany, who coined the term Africa for Africans. And up to 2 years before the Civil War broke out, he was here on the continent already talking to traditional leaders about exodus for those who want to come home. So there's always been an ideological struggle. There's always been a class struggle within the African population in the United States between those who want to stay and try to integrate there and those who want to turn here. And it always, I would say, we're talking about investing in Africa. What are we seeking to invest? It's money. It has to be skills. It has to be something sustainable. We have institution build, not for Africa, but with Africa, within Africa. The institutional strength here is very weak at grassroots level where most of our people suffer. And so it really is not about getting some cheap land in Africa. It really is not about building a mansion to a vision in Africa. It really is not about just in America or the West. When you return, you still have that, is how you invest. It's not about how much money you're going to spend. It's how you invest your gifts. How will you invest your time? How will you invest your spirit? Like, for instance, I can't even count the amount of hours that I spent building with them, man, just giving them confidence, gaining understanding, mutual exchange, and understanding the value of that. Because now, when someone comes here, I can explain things that I learned through those conversations to someone who's never been here that would need that doesn't have to now go through that same process. And so investment in Africa is more than that. Anytime you're investing, you need information. You need to have information. You need to know where to direct those investments and when. And it's not just about money, but let's talk about money even. If there are institutions in Africa that are literally serving the best interests of Africans on the continent and Africans in the diaspora that we are not supporting financially from the diaspora, then we really need to check our conscience. because what happens is that this has been a longer movement than all of these movements that we can talk about.
Right.
Just to go back, we didn't even have a political life in the United States of America in particular until after emancipation, other than movements for that. And but we did have a Exodus movement since 1787.
Mm-hmm.
And so I don't want people to confuse individuals' money and will and desire and dreams in Africa for the collective movement of our people. We have to be connected organizationally. We have to pool our resources. Now, when you come to Africa, you have to actually apply all that stuff we learned in the diaspora. We can only get halfway here from the diaspora. You got to come and apply it. And that application is that investment. That application is that investment, and the reward is the successful exodus of more and more Africans. Now, the way I see the exodus is that Africa is ours. And Africa for Africans at home and abroad is not just a blanket term. Mm-hmm. It's the spirit of our universe. It's the reality of our cause. We have to be able to bring it into fruition. We have to materialize it. And hence, just like the Honorable Marcus Mosiah Garvey preached to us over 100 years ago, we have to send not expats, but experts. You know, we have to send people who know how to improve the agricultural sector in Africa, regardless of the country of your choice. We have to get people here who know how to deal with our sisters. There's so much things going on that many of us who are repatriates are almost ashamed to say in public. Prostitution, drug abuse. Our African brothers and sisters are here suffering, and some of us feel like we can't talk about it without killing people's dreams. No, we got to solve these problems. And we're well equipped for that. So Africa needs our professional investment. Africa needs our conscious investment. And believe it or not, Africa needs to invest in us as well. Africa needs to give us the opportunity to play our historic role in redeeming the motherland. It's not about us being the saviors of anything. Shit, we need to save ourselves. You know, it's about coming together in reality and really just stop talking about it so much. The discouragement of this frenzy with YouTube is that many of these people who are putting their faces and their ideals out there are not trained. They are not organizers. They have not been educated properly. They are literally sabotaging decades and decades, maybe centuries of laying foundation for this particular moment that has come to us now. It's 2021. It's time. We can do it now. It's more practical. No one's waiting for Africans to come save us on boats anymore. We're not on plantations anymore. You know, we're on social media right now, and probably there's Africans from all around the world that's tuned in, listening to this and watching this right now. So with that, let's utilize this social media and realize that there's always going to be opposition, and we need to really confront them, because this exodus is ancestral. It's an ancestral thing. It's an ancestral thing, and our enemies know it.
So this is. Oh, go ahead.
Yes, sir. Go ahead, brother.
Chief Foday, can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Yeah, I didn't mean to cut you. I thought you were pausing. Did you have anything additional that you wanted to share on that same point before we continue?
Well, it's just the point that, you know, I can really appreciate the cultural aspect, particularly with the language emphasis in terms of investment in Africa. When I came here, the only language I could speak was what I know from America, English. And I ran into Creole here. I ran into the Creole language here, and I'm a Gullah Geechee. I remember my mother, my uncles, my aunties, you know, the old people in my life when I was a kid, talking in a real funny, fast way that sound Caribbean, but it was just like fun talk, in-house talk. But I could follow, but I never learned to train my tongue to talk it. And when I got to Freetown, it was like I was just listening to a version of that fun talk that they would have with themselves. And I was like, yo, and I know the history, I know the connection. And so I'm like, yo, this is crazy. I never needed an interpreter. You know, I just had to learn how to talk the language. And now I know how to talk it. And I was able to appreciate it because there's 17 ethnic groups in Sierra Leone. And every single one of them have their own mother tongue, first language, mother tongue. And the national language, the language most spoken right now in Sierra Leone is the Creole language of the Creole ethnic group that only occupy primarily Freetown, Sierra Leone. And so this small group of Africans who were composed of those who were formerly enslaved in North America, those who were formerly enslaved even in Britain, those who were formerly enslaved in the Caribbean, Jamaica, Barbados, St. Vincent, and as well as those who were brought to Freetown, 85,000 from places like Congo, Ghana, Nigeria, Ivory Coast, and brought here to Freetown and resettled among those who had already been brought back from the diaspora. So what you have was like a literal pan-African creation where you have this Creole population. And so many different Africanisms came together to make it what it is, even though it's a colonial language. It's a colonial language because it was evolved under direct colonialism by British. The British didn't just bring us back and set us free and say, go about your business, reintegrate. They brought our ancestors back and then they imposed their system and they ruled our people here. And I would say maybe the first Africans to be directly colonized in West Africa by the British would be the Creoles, would be the community that they actually evolved through their forceful settlement of people who were brought back from enslavement across the water or being rescued off of slave ships destined to go across the water. And so that population is the seed population for this language that that now me I able for talk them all day. Now Creole done become the first language now. You know? So realizing that me being able to talk Creole, I can go anywhere in the country and talk to anybody in any village, and the people can interpret it into their language. And so that means that Creole is a passage language through which I can learn any traditional language as well, probably more easier because the people can talk Creole, but they struggle with English. And so that linguistic investment is like, I'm learning the Creole, but now I'm able to teach my wife is here. She's been here 5 years. I was very pivotal in her learning how to speak it. And other people are coming, and as they come, we're also teaching them and spreading the word of it because it's a valuable way to know how to speak when you come back, when you're coming back from English, because some of it will be more familiar with you, you know, but also you'll find people speaking variants of Creole all over Africa, especially Nigeria, Ghana, the Gambia, even, you know, the Caribbeans. So it's just about being, we can't solve problems if we can't communicate. And so that language investment is very, very important. I definitely appreciate the work that you and the Abibitumi Nation is doing, because the reality is that our people need the options, and those who are serious will come on board. And as long as the students become teachers, I believe that it's a great aspect of passage. Here in Sierra Leone, you have what the Europeans call secret societies, but these are traditional societies. And they are protected by language. There's certain language that you don't know unless you're inside of the society. There's certain codes, and language is not always spoken. Language is also symbology. Language is also music. you know, dance, the way people move their bodies. So African language is not just spoken. That's one thing we have to understand. So African language is so much of a holistic, total expression that we really have to be prepared for that. And so we can teach the linguistic aspects, you know, the text and the words and the speaking, the oral, but we also have to develop a writing system. We also have to, you know, invest in those ways as well. And that means that part of our investment is us being humble enough and wise enough to learn on behalf of those who are coming with us on this exodus. And finding ways to put it on platforms like this where it can be readily available for people that are ready. Because let me tell you, bro, the reason why many people aren't flooding Abibitumi is because they ain't ready. They ain't ready. They know it's going to be serious business. And we can do a lot to lessen people from being intimidated by the seriousness, but it's a serious moment in our story and we have to seize it. And so the language investment is a very, very major investment. Also, I don't sleep on land as well. A lot of people are looking at land like an individualist thing, like it is in America. And we have to leave capitalism when we come home. We have to understand communalism. Now we can come and be capitalists, but we'll just be like our enemies. We'll just be utilizing our enemies' tactics and strategies to get a one-up on the natives. And we can't do that. We have to be communal. And when I say that, what I mean is that in Sierra Leone, for instance, you have to be a citizen to freehold land, to hold land forever. If you're not a citizen, then you can leasehold land, but you at least have to be a resident. And so what happens is that the people protect that freehold by making you become a citizen first. And so it's very important that we understand that, because what's happening is that Sierra Leone and Liberia are the only two countries in Africa that have a Negro clause on their constitutions. If you're not a Negro, you cannot become a naturalized citizen of Sierra Leone or Liberia for now. And both of those Negro clauses are under attack. But our ancestors put them on the books so that it would be clear that politically their position was that they didn't want anyone to be able to own land or to be able to invade and control them through the vote. And that's very, 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 very important, because as we see this new scramble for Africa unfolding, we're seeing that we're seeing a lot of anti-Africanisms being brought back to the continent by those of us who are out in the diaspora. And maybe it's an innocent thing, but those of us who are conscious of it need to check it. And so before it gets out of hand, there's a lot of homosexuality floating around the continent right now. You know, there's a lot of predatory capitalism floating around right now. You know, it's almost like we're coming back like we want to gentrify Africa, you know? And we can modernize Africa without westernizing Africa, you know? And so that's the main thing, is really upgrading our situation here and learning the systems on the ground, because most things here are communitarian, and even land ownership. Most of the people here in Sierra Leone do not privately, personally own land. Most don't even have that kind of value system. Most of the land here are controlled by traditional authorities and divvied out to the community as need be. Farming, a lot of the farming is done communally. Even the commercial farming is done communally. In my village where I belong, we have a local organization, you know, take care of the farm. We're doing farming there. As we farm, we have a marketing team. We're teaching marketing to the family members, show them how to get the crops to the market, to the local markets, send some to Freetown where we can get more bang for the buck, make sure we can turn that into a pharmacy or a medical center or a well or something in the village. So we join the people so that we can be part, at least as ordinary members. And that way, at least we have some say in how the traditional system is going to operate, because it's the traditional system that is suppressed. It's the sovereignty of African people that is being suppressed by neocolonialism, by imperialism. It's capitalism that robs the people of their wealth here on the ground. And we cannot bring those same kind of values and those same kind of activities back home, nor none of those perversions And so there's somewhat of a baptism, somewhat of a spiritual aspect to this as well that people have to be ushered through. And so that investment, us putting that in place, I will believe is the greatest investment, not only in ourselves, because usually we talk about investment, we talk about how us and our families going to benefit from Africa. Whereas most of the people here don't have to privately own land. You know, they live communally. Right. You know what I'm saying? And just, you know, actually coming home and doing the right thing and using these platforms and these programs to institute that. So that definitely, investment is not just money. It takes money to maintain certain investments, but the money itself is not the investment.
So I wanted to, like, you shared a lot. So as you were talking, I was trying to just take a couple of notes, and you went into some of the history and the background about, you know, those who had gone out to, you know, the diaspora and then returned back. And there's an interesting quote by Nana Jedi Shimsu Jehuti, also known as Dr. Jacob Carruthers. And he uses this quote in the sense of literally, but then also physically. It comes from the text of Imahu Sanhat. Now, this is an ancient text from 1976, but that's not 1976 CE, that's 1976 BCE. And it's during the reign of Nesu Biti Sinwos Ret. And basically, this is a man who finds himself in the land of non-Black people, what's called Khasut, right? And what he is told, he decides that in his old age, he wants to return back to the land of Black people. And what the ruler tells him is to return back to Kemet and see again the residence in which you grew, kiss the earth at the great double gate of the palace, and mix with the peers. For now you have begun to grow old. You have lost your manly strength. He says, think of the day of the burial, your passage into blessedness. But basically the idea is that, you know, he was saying that you don't have to be buried like how the non-Blacks bury, right? You don't have to, you know, be made into ashes or, you know, have a ram skin on you, all these things. But basically it's talking about the right of return over 4,000 years ago. Somebody who's in the land of non-Blacks who's being told by the ruler, return to the land of the Black people. And Baba Jedi Shimsu Jehuti puts it in the context of not just physically, but also mentally. And I think you alluded to this, that you have some people who come here, but they've never repatriated. They live here on the continent, but they've never repatriated because they in the Pizza Huts and they in the Burger King and they in all these, you know, other things. Literally, you could eat as though you're in, you know, Atlanta somewhere, or that you're in Detroit somewhere, because again, the Pizza Hut is here, the Burger King is here, all these things. But he's saying return to the land of Black people. So that's, I think, a very poignant quote to even, you know, frame this beyond even just the Western diaspora. And that's something else that I wanted to also just briefly touch on, is that when you look at, for example, the CD community, so these are Black people who were stolen from the continent that we now refer to as Africa. The earliest case in 628 CE, right? So-called AD 628 CD. And these are Black people who would often escape enslavement and run away to establish their own communities. Now, I don't know of any who are able to actually return back to the continent, but that community is still here, going back 1,400 years ago. And, you know, they're literally, like when we talk about Maroon communities, and in many ways, the Geechee Gullah community is just that. And I remember growing up, I grew up in North Carolina, that people would try to diss you. They'd be like, yo, Geechee grandma. And you're supposed to be, oh man, are you talking about my grandma? But they try to use this. But these are some of the bravest warriors who were able to establish themselves in places like the Dismal Swamps. They were able to establish themselves and literally never, ever be conquered. You understand, in places like this? You know, we did another documentary film showing about San Basilio, the Palenque. And this is one of the Palenques there in Colombia. And you have people who have been free ever since, you know, chattel enslavement times, and they never went back, right? So they're still in those types of communities. Now, in terms of the framework in terms of Exodus, I gave a talk called what is Israel in relation to black people, or what was Israel in relation to black people? Because oftentimes when we deal with repatriation, it's in the context of like, you know, this, and that's generally how people used it, was in terms of like a return to the land of black people. Yeah. And then me krano, ye wo nkomedia kakra, nti me krano. Ye beka sawai. That's the language. I didn't cue that up or anything. It's just that's how we be talking, right? But yeah, just to that exact same point. So as we're looking at, you know, the history, as we're looking at, you know, the background, the reason why I did that talk is what was Israel in relation to black people, is so that we can even understand this. So when we're talking about, you know, enslavement, oftentimes we think about enslavement in terms of, you know, the Western diaspora. But in a quote by Manetho, and it's on the invasion of the Hyksos. Now, Manetho is writing in the 3rd century BCE. He talks about how the Hyksos, they overpowered the rulers of the land. They then burned our cities ruthlessly, razed to the ground the temples of the Neteru, and treated all the natives with a cruel hostility, massacring some and leading into slavery the wives and children of others. So here you have, you know, a case of the Hyksos. This is around 3,500 years ago, and they came into the land of black people and they enslaved the black people. When I say land of black people, that's Kemet, literally the land of black people. And then, according to him, they led the people who they could into enslavement. Now, one of the interesting things about it, he says that they were more and more eager to extirpate, meaning exterminate, you know, the Kemetiu, the black people, and their race as a whole was called Hyksos. But the interesting thing is that they were driven out in the first war of black liberation that we know of. And they were driven out by a ruler who you can still see his body in the museum there in Luxor. But they were driven out, and it says that that they left Egypt and journeying over the desert into Syria. They're dreading the power of the Assyrians, who at that time were masters of Asia. They built in the land now called Judea, a city large enough to hold all those thousands of people, and gave it the name of Jerusalem. Now, what's significant about this is that those exact same who came in to enslave, to rape and ravage, to pillage and plunder, were then driven with their tails between their legs. Now, in their story, they say that it was an Exodus, right? But according to the historical documents that were written at the time that that was going on, they were driven out in the first war of black liberation, right? And then those exact same crackers who were driven out went on to found a place called Jerusalem, which is very profound, because oftentimes, and this goes back to the language, because we're not exposed to the language, we're actually rooting for our enemies, right? And rooting against our own ancestors, the black people who were driving out those Amu, driving out those non-blacks in the first war of black liberation. That's one. And then also, if you look at the stela of Nesubiti Merenptah, that's the first mention of Israel anywhere on the face of the entire planet Earth. Is before the Bible was plagiarized and compiled or whatever. But in that mention of Israel, it's listed in the list of enemies of black people. The very first mention of Israel anywhere, and it says Israel is wasted bare of seed. So we have not only those who founded Jerusalem, but then the very first time that Israel is mentioned anywhere on the entire planet Earth is in a list of the enemies of black people. So I bring this up because usually when we're thinking, we can look at Nana Nat Turner. When he's framing what he's doing so in the context of the Old Testament, right? You know, Pharaoh is mean, let my people go, so forth and so on. But just really to frame it beyond like this Exodus and these things into the actual historical documentation of Kemet means land of black people, period. Kemetiu means black people, period. And then those Amu, those Hyksos who came in to rape and ravage, pillage and plunder, to bring death and destruction, those are the enemies of black people. And then when we're framing also returning to the land of black people, we can look over 4,000 years ago to this concept of return to the land of black people. Because if you're not returning, then you're going to have to follow the ways of your enemies. And it's something that when you see over there, people being put in morgues, especially in COVID times, you know, I hear people talking about all these body bags that are just piled up in mass graves. What really is that? Whereas here in the land of black people, you can actually be interred. Where I am, my own title is Bamu Hene Chidom Hene. And the Bamu, these are those who are in charge of making sure that the rulers are interred, right? And then other people, when people die, they don't go to the morgue. We inter them in their house. We do the rituals. We pour the libation to make sure that their spirits are able to go into the ancestral realm. And that's something that we can reconnect with here, that there's nothing like that over in Crackerville. As soon as somebody passes on, you got to go call 911, call the ambulance. They're going to scoop the body up, throw it into a freezer. They're going to mass grave it. You know, it's COVID times, whatever. But that's the disconnection. That's the alienation that we experience when we're in Crackerville that actually seems normal. It seems abnormal that you're going to bury your own dead, right? But ultimately, when we're talking about building community, we think about what we're doing when we're alive. That also part of building community is who is going to bury you. You're going to spend a lot more time deceased than you're ever going to spend alive in this particular form that you're on. So what you ultimately have is the name that you live on. So ultimately, when you build community, then those who bury you are those who you built community with. But when you're on the individualistic thing, then those who bury you. And, you know, I think about this specific to my own parents. My parents have spent their entire lives working for black people, fighting for black people. That's all I know. My great-grandfather was in the UNIA, and he was the Auditor General of the UNIA and received the Knights Commander of the Cross of African Redemption in the UNIA in Brooklyn, right? So when I think about, you know, this lineage, I also think about how the so-called black community there in Crackerville, the reward for those who fight for black people their entire lives is to end up in a nursing home. And I can mention the names of some of those ancestors now. Nganga Fukiao, we're reading his book now. We actually advocated to try to bring him to Ghana in his, you know, later age. But here's somebody who passed on in a nursing home. Nana Yosef Ben Yakinen. Like, if I go down the list, Nana Chancellor Williams, these are like glorious names of those who have fought for black people in the last 100-some-odd years. But their reward for fighting for black people their entire lives is that they get dumped in a nursing home. And it's almost like people have, you know, what do they call this? People have like the sands of time just turning, you know, waiting for them to die so they can then say, look, they did such a good job. Oh, yeah, we got to have a big funeral for them. They did such a good job. So part of what I'm doing on the ground here is to make sure that my own parents have a place to come back to, that my own parents have a place where they're not going to end up in a nursing home for, you know, anything, you know, just like had happened with so many of our other esteemed elders, that I'm building my house so my parents can live in my house, so that they can tell stories to my children, because this is an intergenerational fight. And as we're doing this intergenerational fight, you know, it's not only for our own biological family, but it's also to extend it out. So that's some of the work we're also doing with Repatriate to Ghana. So when I got citizenship, everybody who got citizenship, they brought their forms to my office at African Studies, right? And we made sure that all of those were able to get citizenship. So it wasn't just an individual thing. And actually my parents and my wife, none of them got citizenship in the first batch, right? Because it wasn't just a nepotism thing. We're trying to make sure we get citizenship, but they did get it in the second batch. Otherwise, I probably wouldn't have, you know, much to say. My parents would have, you know, gone to the spanking like they did when I was young. But, you know, as we're doing it, 34 got citizenship in the first time around. 126 got citizenship in the second time around. And again, every single one of those, their forms came to my office, and I made sure that those were, you know, passed on to the president and so forth and so on. So I've also talked, you know, for a little bit just to kind of set the tone. You know, when I'm talking about Exodus, it's not that people can't use the word, you know, people sing the Bob Marley song and whatever, but just to also frame it in the context of when we're dealing with our history, it's not only the Western diaspora, because when we look at revolutions and rebellions, the earliest rebellion outside of the continent that I'm aware of is the Zans Rebellion. And this is in 868 to 883 CE. And these are black people who have been taken to modern day Iraq. And I think that when we talk about diaspora, the Eastern diaspora is the one that is not thought about often, even though literally they were uprooted from the continent and enslaved in these, crackified places. But this is the other side that I also want to bring in, because Nana Marcus Garvey in African fundamentalism, he talks about a Negro nation, a Negro empire upon which the sun will never set. This means that those black people, literally black people, kinky head, not, whatever, the red dot on the forehead, none of that. Literally black people taken from Tanzania. We know where they were taken from Zanzibar, right? The Zans Revolution, the word Zans is coming from where they call Azania, Zanzibar, Tanzania, all these other things. So that's the other side that I also want us to just bring in, so that sort of like the work that Nana Rodoko Rashidi does, is helps us to think globally. Because when we're working for Black Power, when we're working for uniting the entire Black nation, it's also the Black people in Bougainville who fought for their liberation against Rio Tinto Zinc. It's also the Black people in the Chagos Islands who had their land stolen away from them. It's also the Sidis in India. It's the blackest of the Black people outside of maybe everywhere but Sudan that we're also talking about. So just to add additional context to what you shared, and I definitely appreciate the historical background that you brought to the table. But now I'm thinking about the work that you're doing on the ground. I know oftentimes when people, talk, and you kind of alluded to this, and I joke that people in Crackerville, they sit with binoculars and telescopes, and they sit, on the beach, and they're like, is it perfect yet? Oh, it's not perfect? Okay, call me when it's perfect. And then they go back to that 9-to-5 job building the white nation. Not everybody, right? I know some people online, y'all are doing some work. I'm not going to everybody, but generally speaking. And then, the next year they get out their telescope, their binoculars, and they're like, all right, is everything perfect yet? Oh, no. All right, well, call me when it's perfect. And it's like all of the fight that we consider ourselves to be fighting to refine white world terror domination in Crackerville, because that's ultimately the only thing that's going to happen. All the protests are just going to make them hide it just a little bit more, refine it a little bit more, so that the next generation will have an even harder time identifying who the enemy is. That's what that fight is. But here we're fighting for our own soil, right? That one is behind enemy lines. These are the front lines, right? This is the battleground, and where we are right now is the front lines. So it's not that all of the work is already done for us. It's not that everything is perfect. But if anybody is here in order to make it better than it was before, it's us working together, not under the Cracker Savior, industrial complex, or, the House Negro Savior industrial complex, but working hand in hand, not being separate and saying we're going to have our own, separate thing away from the natives. What's that going to get us? Right. The last thing I'll say on that, I always talk about the Liberia Sierra Leone scapegoat. And that's what continental Africans do sometimes, is they'll say, oh, well, the people who came back, they thought that they were better than the natives. So, that's what the whole Civil War was about. And I'm like, that's really not the totality of what that's about, because the common denominator in every conflict on the continent is about the resources. So people hear blood diamonds, but they don't connect it to that. But if you look at Eastern Congo, there's not a single, person from the diaspora who came back. And then, that's what the coltan is all about. But what it does have in common is that you have coltan there, and there are resources there, and these crackers don't want to pay for it. So in exchange for $1 billion in coltan, they'll give you a machine gun or two, and then you go shoot your enemy, who you consider to be your enemy, who's really your own brother. If you look at southeastern Nigeria, that one is about oil. None of the diasporans are there to, point a finger at and make it a scapegoat. It's all about the resources. If you look at Mali, it's about the nuclear interest that France has there in northwestern Niger. We could go on and on. If you look at Darfur, it's about the oil there too. But I want you to, one, talk about the work that you're doing, and then also anything that you have to say about the Liberia and Sierra Leone scapegoat example, because the Tutsis and the Hutus, there were no diasporans to blame there, so now what's going on? But what you do, again, have in common is the resources that the crackers want to steal and they don't want to pay for. If you could speak to your own work and that dynamic as well, I'd appreciate it.
Absolutely. I guess I'll just start right there, man. I appreciate that. The full scope of what you just laid down is so dynamic, in the fact that especially the aspect of how far back the aspirations for Africans who had been in the diaspora, even like you said, 4,000 years ago, 3,500 years ago, still had that in them that there was something special and sacred, and Africa was home. That's very, 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 very key, is that we ain't starting nothing new. That's why I said, man, historically, we just continuing to be our ancestors in actuality. And the inclusion of the African brothers and sisters in the East is very, very, very key as well. I agree with that 100%. There's so many people who descend from us, from this continent, that are black people, that we a lot of times don't even consider. There's what they call American exceptionalism, right? African Americans got American exceptionalism. We think we're the only people who've been through something, huh? only our struggle is it.
Right.
And so, we got to control it, And the reality, I guess I'll touch on the Sierra Leone Liberia dynamic, because it pains me as well, bro. Oftentimes, the first rebuttal is, what about when Liberia and Sierra Leone happened and we went over there and just took advantage of the natives and this and that? But it, like you said, it really just didn't happen just like that. There were Africans in the diaspora who believed that they were being repatriated for the purpose of freedom and land. And that's what those initial ancestors thought they was in it for. They wasn't coming back to fight nobody, to get even Steven with nobody, to take anything. In fact, when you go back and check, it wasn't the Africans themselves who brokered treaties for land or produced the guns that was used to encroach on land. All of these things were European Yoruba creations and imposed. Another aspect, and I think this is the most vital aspect of it, those ancestors who came back from the diaspora, particularly from the United States of America, to make up Liberia and Sierra Leone. And I can also include those who came from the Caribbean as well in that journey to these two countries. Their aspirations was freedom. That's why it's Freetown and Liberia. It was freedom that they were seeking, but they also was against slavery. Anti-slavery mentality is what they had. They was against the transatlantic slave trade. They wasn't for it. And when we understand that, you realize that there were still Africans collaborating with Europeans and enslaving Africans for years here in this country, even while our ancestors were establishing Freetown, building the first streets, building the first homes, building the first little churches, the first little communities. 27 miles north is Bunch Island, one of the main slave fortresses that sent many of our ancestors to South Carolina, particularly to feed the rice production.
That's right.
And it's only 27 miles away from Freetown. Now, the British didn't ban the transatlantic slave trade until 1807, 1808. So from 1787, when our ancestors first came back to this land, and that next 20 years, they was actively enslaving Africans and sending them to the West right here, 27 miles away.
That's right.
And so you got to understand that our mentality was anti that. Even here in the case of Freetown, you find that the indigenous Timini leader who actually made the first agreement with the British, his name was King Nangbana. And Nangbana was a regent. Actually, he didn't have the power to actually seal no deal like that, and it ultimately led to the first colony being burned to the ground by the indigenous later on. And so King Nangbana, he was a Timini leader that was opposed to the transatlantic slave trade because his people had been greatly affected. So when the Europeans came and said, hey man, we about to bring your people back who they had took over there, it was like, bring them, come on, let's get it. So the Africans who were enslaved returning was warmly welcomed by their Timni brothers and sisters here. But it was the Europeans' colonial dealings that turned one against the other. And it's very important to understand that, and at least in the case of Freetown, where I can talk at least from studies more than what I can say about Liberia. In 1792, almost 1,200 Africans who were formerly enslaved in the United States, predominantly in the same region where today the United States calls the U.S. Gullah Geechee Cultural Heritage Corridor. North Carolina, South Carolina, Florida, and Georgia, over 600, 700 of them came from there. So almost half that population, if they never came back, would be right over there. These are the same people as us. We got to understand the story of our people, particularly. And they chose to come back. Their migration was very, very organized. They organized themselves into church congregations. They pooled their resources. They chose their leaders. They protested the British government. They aligned with those who claimed that they were against slavery. And that's how they came back. It wasn't like an invasion. But the British had other plans. One of the first things that happened is that there was a brother named Thomas Peters from Wilmington, North Carolina, the same place where Asada Shakur is from, her family from, right there in the Gullah Geechee Cultural Heritage Corridor. He was he's the real founder of Freetown. He led the protest to Britain. He went over and partnered with what was called the Sierra Leone Company at that time. The Sierra Leone Company was owned by white abolitionists from Britain, British abolitionists. So he went over there and appealed to them like, yo, they treating us bad in Canada. We want to go to Africa. We heard that y'all sent a trip from of our people down there and their colony got destroyed. We want to go back and revive it. And they agreed. The British government paid the money and everything for the 13 ships to bring them back, all this. But they came back under the notion that they were going to rule themselves. They would be sovereign on their land. And the British government had different ideals. Actually, I should say the Sierra Leone Company, because the country of Sierra Leone originated as a company, right, and still is a company. Right. And so that applies universally as well, how they set up these Westphalian systems of nation states. That's a whole nother discussion. But just to understand our own story within these transitions, when we got back, Thomas Peters, the founder of Freetown, he was dead within 1 year. Within that 1 year that he was back, he began to protest the Sierra Leone Company because they were already showing signs of being a colonial company. They came back, and then their board of administrators became the colonial power to dictate to the Africans they brought back how they was going to live. And that wasn't the deal in Canada. And what happened is that he tried to organize a rebellion and died, ultimately marginalized by elements of the community that was pro-British and anti his rebellion. Fast forward about 7 years to 1798, 99, and what you have is you have the first expression of anti-colonial resistance, where there was Africans who were repatriates, mainly from Nova Scotia, those who already had fought in the American Revolution. They called them Black loyalists. They was fighters. They aligned with the Koyatimini people, who were the indigenous people who held the land of where Freetown was established, and they fought and rose up in a rebellion against the Sierra Leone Company in 1799. In 1800, that rebellion was put down. They fought and they almost overwhelmed the British company here in Freetown. This is indigenous forces and diaspora forces fighting together in Freetown 7 years after it's founded. The British sent for 600 Maroons, Jamaican Maroons, that they had formerly evacuated from Jamaica and took into Nova Scotia. and brought them over to Freetown, and they beat the Nova Scotians and the Timneys up for the British. And so we got the reason why I'm telling that story is because we don't watch ourselves that it happened again.
That's right.
Controlled our positions.
That's right.
And so even that story right there is even more highlighted because those who were considered the Nova Scotian rebellions, the rebels, they were arrested, exiled, some were killed, and then their land was turned over to the Maroons. And now in the heart of Freetown, there's a place called Maroon Town, where there's Maroon Church, right by the cotton tree where Freetown was founded at, and it's called Maroon Town. And really, that's the first settlement of the rebel, those who rebelled. But you have to dig deeper into the history to know that that exists. Now, on the other hand, the population that came to create Freetown wasn't just those who came from abroad. There was already Africans here. There was already Africans here. There was already Africans here. It was not a American smallpox, destroy the whole population kind of situation here. Indigenous Africans from this modern country of Sierra Leone also make up part of the population that was here from day one in Freetown. We joined them. It was a reintegration. And so that's very important to understand. But it was the politics of the British that led to the colonial antagonisms between the people who came to be known as Creoles and those who came to be known, quote unquote, as the people of the country or the country folk. And that antagonism still exists to this day at certain levels. Now, to also go about Liberia, we're talking about a situation where here the indigenous people are still enslaving Africans. And we're still returning from enslavement with an abolitionist mindset, a militant abolitionist mindset. These are Africans who literally fought to be in their situation. And so it wasn't like it was just like a welfare line. Hey, you want to go to Africa? Just sign up. It wasn't like that. Right. These are people that they had to remove from the population because they was too militarized through their wars. And so, long story short, Liberia case, they use it as a justification, but it's amazing that they let the European companies and corporations like Firestone off the hook. Exactly. You know, it's very important to understand that the Liberia was established by an act of Congress, United States Congress. You know, that there's always been this struggle among African people in the diaspora in particular, and not just in America. I don't want to sound like an exceptionalist. I'm just using this as an example because we can really highlight it here and understand it. But you know, for the case of Liberia, yes, it was a situation where there was a lot of mulattoes who came back that formed a talented kind of group, actually. And in both cases, whether it's Liberia or Sierra Leone, Freetown, both of these places are places that when the United States government and British used their militaries to suppress the transatlantic slave trade, they brought those who they rescued back to these places. And so this is a part of the mafia that we don't talk about. There was people on slave ships at one point who was destined for the West, but the British said that this was outlawed. And the United States joined the British in suppressing the slave trade, and the Africans that they rescued, quote unquote, rescued during that time were brought back to these countries. And so those populations that came from this became creolized, of course. And then at the same time, in the future, with the Liberia situation, they used the existence of that group as an excuse for why all the problems in Liberia was happening. But that's just not true when you really investigate the history and you understand why people may not have just hit the ground and integrated. How can you hit the ground and integrate when You don't know the language first. Right. Secondly, there's still tribal warfare going on. People still fighting, like what you said, over resources, trade resources. There was trade routes that were being interrupted by the interference of European commerce at the coast. You know, we can talk about that a little bit too, because it's always a battle for resources. Politics is about power and concentrated economics. It's always a fight for resources and who should control them and who will benefit from them. And when we understand that, we look at it differently. The Africans, our ancestors on this continent that were caught up in this internal warfare, is directly tied to the economic warfare that the Western presence, the European presence on the coast, manifested. What it really meant for African economies that were largely based not on a coastal trade system, but on a system that was based on the interior of Africa. And so you find that people who may have been disadvantaged in their geographical positioning at the coast or in the forest belt, previously, they became advantaged because of the opportunity to trade with the Westerners, with the Europeans. And so it's very, very important. Like, for instance, let me give you an example. Salt. Salt was worth more than gold to us in our value system, in at least during the Mali Empire. People say how wealthy Mansa Musa was in gold, but do you know that salt was worth more value than gold in Mali?
Right.
So there was something worth more than gold to Mansa Musa. Economically. And we don't understand these things, but where were they getting the gold? A lot of the salt, just like a lot of the cola was coming from the forest regions. Cola was also currency. Salt was also currency. We believed in a free market barter system, value for value exchange. And when the European came, they met markets that were already established. They met economies that were already controlled by Africans. And they interrupted those trade markets. And let me tell you how. Salt along the coast from Senegal down to Sierra Leone, Liberia. The people at the coast were already involved in salt production, and they were the ones who were trading it with the people who were from the interior, the savannah areas, the Manding people, the Malians, you know, the Fulani people, the Fulais. Their salt supply was coming from the coastal peoples, who a lot of times spoke a different language, in fact, going back to language being a factor. Here in Sierra Leone, you have what they call the Atlantic languages. It's a divergence of the Niger-Congo that became prominent in the forest region, as well as on the coast here, and spoken by groups like the Bulang, the Timini, the Gullah, the Gizi. These are some of the groups that spoke this language. And of course, Manding, or the language of Mali, was a different language system. And that's very, very important to understand that if you're African and I'm African, but you're speaking a different language than me and a different culture than me, and you live in a different region than me, then we can collaborate or we're going to clash. And a lot of that happened. A lot of that happened because new trade partners showed up at the coast. And instead of what they did was they sat at places like Cape Verde, and they established relationships with the salt traders all up and down the coast. And then they used that salt as currency, as partial currency, for items that they needed from the interior of Africa. Meaning that salt was one of the things that they utilized, that Africans produced, and they seized the market over to produce to purchase Africans. They were purchasing with our own salt because we seen value with the salt. And so those salt markets got shut down. the cola market. Cola, like we said, we wasn't worried about no crackers on no paper. It was about cola. Even now, you can't marry people without cola.